The Mediterranean sun was climbing toward its zenith, casting silver glimmers across the restless waves below. From high above, a formation of Italian Macchi fighters sliced through the cobalt sky, engines humming with the confidence born of countless patrols. Their pilots, veterans of North Africa and the early Mediterranean campaigns, were accustomed to a rhythm of air superiority that rarely faltered. Yet, on this morning, a strange silhouette appeared on the horizon. Its wings bent sharply in a gull-like curve, its fuselage unusually broad, its sheer bulk unlike anything they had trained to engage. At first, laughter erupted over the radio. "Is that a plane? Or some American joke?" one pilot sneered. The Corsair's design seemed almost comical. Its inverted gull wings, initially conceived to accommodate a massive propeller, and its heavy airframe, which seemed cumbersome at cruising speed, were, to these seasoned men, signs of inept engineering. There was a confidence in their mirth, a hubris sharpened by months of easy victories over lighter, nimbler aircraft. The men had no inkling that the gull-winged giant before them was no ordinary aircraft. Vought's F4U Corsair had been honed in the crucible of Pacific warfare, and its appearance in the Mediterranean represented a technological leap the Axis had scarcely anticipated. Its reputation was whispered only in the most cautious intelligence reports. Faster than the Macchi, more durable, and armed with 650 caliber Browning machine guns capable of delivering concentrated destruction within seconds. But that knowledge had yet to reach the front lines. All the pilots saw was an awkward shape, an oversized American novelty, ripe for ridicule. As the Corsairs drew closer, their engines singing a high-pitched, throaty war cry, the initial laughter lingered, stubborn against the encroaching unease. The Italians banked the saws, airplanes, attempting to position themselves for what they expected to be an easy skirmish. The bright sun reflected off the polished wings of the Corsairs, glinting in a way that momentarily blinded a young pilot, eliciting another nervous chuckle that he tried to mask. The gull-wing planes glided with deceptive grace, their speed underestimated, their weight a secret advantage. Below, the waves seemed unaware of the looming confrontation, stretching endlessly, indifferent. The pilots, however, were acutely aware of the stakes. This was not a training exercise, nor a mere scouting mission. Yet, buoyed by prior successes, the Italian airmen saw themselves as masters of this sky. The Corsair, they believed, was merely a curiosity, a machine whose size and design were laughable compared to the sleek elegance of their own fighters. But history has a way of humbling the arrogant. Within moments, the first bursts of gunfire would erase any illusions of superiority. In these seconds, the tension between confidence and impending disaster was almost tangible. The gull-winged silhouette, once the source of laughter, was about to redefine every expectation these pilots held about speed, power, and aerial combat. Their underestimation, born of familiarity and hubris, would soon be met with a brutal, unforgiving reality, the deadly precision of 650 caliber machine guns unleashed in unrelenting fury. For the Italians, the sight of the Corsair would be remembered not as curiosity or joke, but as the first harbinger of chaos descending from the skies above the Mediterranean. It was a plane that laughed last, and would do so with bullets. The intelligence reports had been clear, or so the Italians thought. Pages filled with diagrams, speed charts, and second-hand accounts painted the F4U Corsair as a lumbering giant, a machine built for rugged Pacific carriers rather than nimble Mediterranean skirmishes. Slow, the reports read, clumsy, easily outmaneuvered. These were not merely opinions. They were the distilled observations of Axis reconnaissance pilots, filtered through layers of bureaucracy and optimism. To the men flying Macchi C-202s and the newer C-205s, these words confirmed their biases. The Corsair could be toyed with, outpaced, and perhaps even humiliated. The Macchi C-202 Folgore had long been Italy's pride. Sleek, fast, and responsive, it danced through the air with an elegance that rivaled the best of the Luftwaffe. Its successor, the C-205 Veltro, promised even greater speed and firepower, a plane designed to dominate the skies of Europe and North Africa. The pilots, accustomed to this sense of superiority, measured every aircraft against their own machine's agility and responsiveness. Against such expectations, the Corsair, with its awkward gull wings and deep fuselage, seemed almost a caricature of American engineering, impressive on paper, but likely a slow, overbuilt target in reality. Yet beneath the laughter and casual taunts, a subtle unease began to creep in. There was an instinctive sense that the reports might have overlooked something, that experience in the Pacific was not the same as experience in the Mediterranean. But this doubt was easily pushed aside. Training drills, past victories, and the comforting hum of familiar engines reinforced the illusion of mastery. To a Macchi pilot, to mock the Corsair was not arrogance, it was habit, a reflex forged by confidence in one's craft and machine. The Corsair's reputation in Allied circles told a very different story. American pilots celebrated its speed, its climb rate, and the devastating punch of its .650 caliber Browning machine guns. Carrier pilots spoke in hushed tones of dogfights in which the Corsair emerged almost untouchable, shrugging off enemy fire and delivering punishing counterattacks with brutal precision. But these tales, carried across oceans and filtered through limited access intelligence, were either dismissed or simply unknown to the men preparing to engage the aircraft over Sicily and Sardinia. This gap between myth and reality created a dangerous complacency. Pilots banked, climbed, and approached their targets with an air of superiority, believing that their C-202s and C-205s would outmatch any American giant they might encounter. The air was filled with confident chatter over radio channels, casual jokes about the Corsair's awkward shape, and the familiar adrenaline of an expectedly routine sortie. What they did not anticipate was the immediacy of the shock awaiting them, the kind of shock that would turn laughter into fear in the span of seconds. Even as they drew closer to the approaching Corsairs, their minds clung to the reports and to the comforting myth of a slow, ungainly opponent. Every maneuver, every tactical calculation was shaped by a false premise. They were preparing to fight a machine that did not exist in the form they imagined. And this misjudgment, this failure to see beyond the surface, would soon have deadly consequences. The Mediterranean sky, bright and open, masked the imminent chaos. Beneath the laughter and bravado, the seeds of panic were already being sown, waiting for the moment when the Corsair's true capabilities would emerge, shattering every assumption and turning the confidence of seasoned pilots into frantic survival instinct. The sky above the Mediterranean was a canvas of brilliant blue, stretching endlessly over waves that sparkled like fractured glass. The Italian formation, tight and confident, sliced through this brilliance, their engines singing a familiar hymn of power and precision. For a moment, the pilots allowed themselves a fleeting sense of superiority, until the first Corsairs appeared on the horizon. They came in fast, almost impossibly fast, their gull-winged silhouettes cutting through the air with deceptive grace. At first the Italians maintained their usual composure, banking and adjusting formation, still clinging to the belief that these were lumbering giants, easy prey for seasoned C-202s and C-205s. But as the Corsairs drew closer, the subtle hum of their engines, a higher-pitched, more violent note than the Italians were used to, hinted at something more formidable. Then it began. The first tracers streaked across the sky like fiery needles. At a distance, the Italian pilots saw their comrades' aircraft erupt in bursts of smoke and flame, pieces of fuselage tearing away as if shredded by some invisible giant's hand. Screams of surprise and panic broke through the radio chatter. The Corsair's .650 caliber Browning machine guns were no myth. They were real and deadly beyond imagination. Bullets tore through wings, fuselages, and control surfaces, sparking fires in engines that had never known such punishment. The Italians tried to maneuver, to dive and roll as they had countless times before, but the Corsair's speed and climb rate nullified their efforts. Every evasive turn was anticipated, every escape route cut off by the relentless fire. A C-202 banking too sharply suddenly lost a wingtip, spiraling into the sea with a scream that echoed only faintly over the radio. The pilot's laughter, once so loud and assured, vanished into the roar of engines and the metallic rattle of destruction. From the cockpit the scene was apocalyptic. Flames licked the sky from burning fuselages, smoke trails tangled with the glint of sunlight on metal, and the deep blue waters below became a mosaic of wreckage. Some pilots reported the sensation of being watched, as if the Corsairs were not merely aircraft but sentient predators, calculating every move, punishing every misjudgment. Fear replaced confidence in a heartbeat. What had seemed a simple skirmish now felt like a descent into chaos. In these moments, experience mattered little. Veteran pilots who had survived North Africa and Sicily found themselves helpless against the raw power and firepower of the Corsairs. One young pilot later wrote in a diary, "I thought I knew the skies. Until that day. They were ghosts, machines with fire in their bellies. We did not fight them. We ran or we died." The Mediterranean, usually a theater of pride and mastery, had become a graveyard of assumptions. Every second stretched unbearably. Smoke, tracer fire, and the cries of men filled the vast expanse above the sea. And as quickly as it began, the first engagement ended. The Corsairs veered away, leaving a trail of devastation and stunned survivors. The Italians had glimpsed for the first time the true capability of their enemy, and it was more horrifying than any intelligence report or rumor could have conveyed. The myth of the slow, clumsy American plane was dead. In its place lay a terrifying reality, a machine designed not just to fight, but to annihilate, turning laughter into horror and confidence into desperation. The Mediterranean air, once a serene expanse of sunlit blue, now vibrated with the deadly hum of 650 caliber Browning machine guns. The Corsair's reputation, whispered in intelligence briefings, was about to be etched into the minds of Italian pilots in stark, visceral detail. Each wing of the F4U carried 3 of these monstrous guns, synchronized to fire with terrifying precision. The result was a hailstorm of lead, a wall of fire that could slice through the aluminum skin of any Axis fighter like paper. From the cockpit, the experience was almost surreal. Pilots described bursts of fire that seemed to come from every angle, the sheer volume of bullets creating a deafening metallic symphony. The .50 Browning, with a rate of fire exceeding 800 rounds per minute per gun, was capable of delivering thousands of projectiles in the span of seconds. Combined with the Corsair's incredible speed and maneuverability, this armament made each aircraft a near impossible opponent. A single burst could sever control cables, punch through fuselages, and ignite fuel lines with terrifying regularity. The psychological impact was instantaneous. Experienced Italian aviators, men who had faced the rigors of North African skies and countless dogfights, could scarcely comprehend the destructive potential they now faced. "I watched my friend's plane disintegrate before my eyes," one pilot recalled later. "I couldn't believe it. I thought we were exaggerating the Americans. I was wrong. This can't be happening." The words, uttered in disbelief over the radio and later recorded in diaries, captured the shock that rippled through every squadron. The technical specifications alone were enough to inspire awe. Each .50 caliber round could pierce nearly 2 inches of armor at close range, and even at extended distances, the bullets retained enough velocity to tear through fuselage and wing alike. Combined with synchronized firing and high muzzle velocity, the Corsair could engage multiple targets simultaneously, shredding formations that had once felt invincible. For pilots trained to rely on agility and experience, these guns nullified every assumption. In the skies above the Mediterranean, theory collided brutally with reality. Pilots who had studied charts and mock engagements found that no amount of tactical knowledge could instantly counter the sheer lethality of the Corsair's firepower. Maneuvers that had worked against lighter, less well-armed fighters were futile against this combination of speed, climb, and armament. The once cocky Italian airmen were forced into defensive maneuvers they had never imagined needing, their confidence eroding with every tracer that whistled past. Even after retreating from their first encounter, the impression lingered. Messerschmitts, Spitfires, and Italian fighters had their strengths, but the Corsair's armament redefined the concept of aerial killing power. The psychological weight was nearly as deadly as the bullets themselves. Fear replaced bravado, hesitation replaced instinct, and the laughter that had greeted the gull-winged silhouette was now silenced, replaced by a grim realization. These machines had been underestimated at the peril of every pilot who faced them. By the end of that fateful sortie, Italian squadrons had learned a lesson written in steel and fire. The Corsair was no mere curiosity or clumsy American plane. It was a weapon designed for annihilation, and every Italian who encountered it understood that surviving it would demand more than skill alone. It would demand adaptation, respect, and a recalculation of what the skies truly demanded. The skies above Sicily were no longer a stage for confident mastery. They had become a battlefield of harsh lessons and brutal reality. Italian pilots, trained in the doctrines of energy fighting and dive bombing, found their tactics rendered ineffective against the Corsair's unique combination of speed, climb, and firepower. Maneuvers that once allowed them to outpace and outsmart enemy aircraft were now met with calculated counters, leaving even the most seasoned flyers grasping for solutions in mid-air. Dive bombing, a tactic long relied upon for its speed and impact, became a liability. Pilots would roll into a steep descent, hoping to gain the kinetic advantage and strike from above. But the Corsair, with its superior power-to-weight ratio, matched and exceeded their dives. Pilots attempting to pull out of attacks were met with precision fire from 650 caliber guns, bullets tearing through wings and fuselage before any maneuver could save them. The very tactics meant to secure victory were now instruments of vulnerability, turning confidence into peril. Energy fighting, a method emphasizing altitude advantage, speed retention, and positional control, also faltered. Italian pilots, used to exploiting these dynamics against similar aircraft, discovered that the Corsair could climb faster, turn harder, and accelerate away from any engagement that threatened it. A Macchi C-205 attempting to trade altitude for speed found itself outclassed, the enemy's engines roaring past as rounds whistled by with deadly accuracy. Every calculated loop, every banking turn, became a gamble against a foe who could exploit mistakes in seconds. Overconfidence, the invisible enemy, compounded the danger. Pilots who had previously encountered only lightly armed or predictable adversaries now found themselves making split-second decisions under fire, where hesitation could mean death. Forma. Italian discipline faltered as individuals attempted to flee or engage independently, breaking cohesion and exposing the group to concentrated Corsair attacks. Moments that once allowed for controlled engagement now devolved into chaos, punctuated by the sounds of tearing metal, exploding fuel tanks, and frantic radio chatter. The psychological effect was immediate and corrosive. Letters recovered from surviving pilots recount a mixture of disbelief and fear. One wrote, "I had flown against many planes, but never a machine like this. Every maneuver I knew, every trick I practiced, failed me. I could only pray I survived each pass." The stark contrast between training and reality forced rapid adaptation, though the price for each mistake was high. This exposure of tactical inadequacy illustrated a larger truth about air combat. Skill alone could not compensate for a mismatch in technology and firepower. The Corsair was designed to exploit precisely these miscalculations, punishing overconfidence and rewarding disciplined execution. For Italian pilots, each engagement revealed the limits of their training and the brutal efficiency of their enemy. By the end of these early encounters, it became clear that survival depended on more than instinct or experience. It demanded respect for the Corsair's capabilities, a re-evaluation of old tactics, and a humility forged in smoke, fire, and the jagged trails of fallen comrades. The Italian airmen had laughed at the gull-winged American plane, but now laughter was gone, replaced with a sober understanding of vulnerability and the lethal precision of a machine that was rewriting the rules of aerial warfare. The sky, once a theater of calculated maneuvers and confident dominance, now became a corridor of death. Smoke trails streaked across the deep blue Mediterranean, punctuated by sudden bursts of flame as Italian aircraft were shredded mid-air. Engines coughed, wings disintegrated, and fuselages cracked under the relentless hail of 50 caliber fire. The gull-winged Corsairs moved with ruthless precision, exploiting every mistake, punishing every misjudgment. For the pilots, panic set in like a cold hand clutching the chest. One young aviator, barely 20, recounted later in his diary, "I saw my friend's plane explode, and I froze. I had no time to think, only to act. I rolled, I dove, I prayed the bullets missed me." Ejections, rare and often dangerous in their own right, became desperate measures. Some pilots bailed over the shimmering waters, their parachutes opening shakily, leaving them to drift over the sparkling sea below. Others attempted to nurse smoking, bullet-ridden planes back toward friendly territory, the air vibrating with the high-pitched whistle of rounds cutting through metal around them. Morale disintegrated with every passing second. Radio chatter, once filled with confident orders and casual banter, became a cacophony of fear, calls for help, frantic warnings, and abrupt silence as entire sections vanished from formation. Experienced pilots who had survived countless sorties now realized that training and skill might not be enough to save them from the Corsairs' relentless onslaught. Each loss was personal. The image of a comrade spiraling helplessly toward the sea, or of a plane splitting in midair with smoke and fire curling into the sky, left a scar deeper than any statistic could convey. Families, friends, and the sense of invincibility nurtured over years of air combat were stripped away in moments measured not by hours, but by seconds. The psychological impact was immense. Even those who survived the initial encounters were shaken, their confidence eroded by the sheer suddenness of destruction. Tactical cohesion, already tested in the previous section, began to crumble entirely. Pilots scattered, attempting to flee or regroup haphazardly, leaving gaps in formations that only increased vulnerability. The Corsairs, exploiting every opening, struck with surgical efficiency. What had been laughter and confidence just minutes before was replaced with a growing sense of dread, a recognition that the skies themselves had turned against them. Reports from the surviving squadrons later described the harrowing scene in near disbelief. "We were trained to expect the unexpected," one pilot wrote, "but nothing prepared us for this. They tore through us like paper. No maneuver worked, no formation saved us. Only chaos remained." The first losses were not merely numbers. They were the shattering of assumptions, a brutal lesson in hubris and underestimation. By the end of the engagement, the Mediterranean skies bore the scars of battle. Smoking wrecks drifting toward the sea, the echoes of engines lost forever, and the shattered morale of pilots forced to confront a reality harsher than any they had imagined. The Corsair had not merely attacked, it had redefined the terms of aerial warfare for anyone daring to challenge it. After the initial chaos of the first encounters, a grim clarity began to settle over the surviving Italian pilots. The laughter and disbelief of earlier days gave way to a sober, almost fearful analysis. They had underestimated the Corsair, and now, piece by piece, they began to understand why this aircraft had proven so devastating. The F4U Corsair was not simply a large plane with heavy armament. It was a marvel of engineering, designed to dominate the skies. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double-wasp radial engine generated over 2,000 horsepower, propelling the aircraft to speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour at operational altitude, a figure that consistently outpaced Italian fighters in the same class. Its climb rate, astonishing for such a bulky frame, allowed it to gain altitude faster than most adversaries, enabling it to strike from unexpected angles with devastating effect. Agility, often assumed to be the domain of lighter planes like the Macchi C-202 Folgore, was another secret weapon. Despite its size, the Corsair could execute tight turns, rapid dives, and swift rolls without losing momentum. The gull-winged design, originally intended to accommodate its massive propeller while allowing shorter, stronger landing gear, also provided subtle, aerodynamic advantages that improved stability during high-speed maneuvers. For pilots accustomed to measuring skill in seconds of turn time and tight maneuvers, the Corsair defied all expectations. When compared to the Italian Macchi C202 and the newer C205, the differences became stark. The C202 had a top speed of around 370 miles per hour, respectable but insufficient against the Corsair's burst capabilities. Its climb rate, while competitive, could not match the American fighters, leaving Italian pilots vulnerable in vertical engagements. Even the C205, faster and heavier, lacked the combination of firepower, speed, and structural resilience that the Corsair brought to every encounter. Every misjudged dive, every attempted turning engagement revealed the cruel truth. The Axis pilots had been fighting a machine whose advantages nullified many of their own strengths. The emotional weight of this realization hit hard. Pilots recounted moments in which they saw their carefully calculated maneuvers fail, their confidence shattered as Corsairs zipped past with deadly precision. One diary entry reflected the despair. "We thought we knew the skies. We thought our planes were masters of the air. But this was something else. We had been blind." The air above Sicily and Sardinia was no longer a stage for pride. It was a crucible of hard lessons, forcing even the most experienced pilots to confront the gap between expectation and reality. This technical understanding was not merely academic. It translated immediately into fear. Pilots had begun to see the Corsair not as an opponent, but as a predator. Its speed, climb, and agility combined with unmatched firepower made it a machine that punished mistakes mercilessly. Every second spent misjudging its capabilities could, and often did, cost a life. For the Italian squadrons, comprehension came with a bitter irony. The aircraft they had mocked, dismissed, and underestimated was now the benchmark by which all future engagements would be measured. The Corsair was fast, strong, and precise. And the Axis pilots, humbled and fearful, had no illusions left. Surviving the next encounter would require more than skill. It would demand respect, adaptation, and an understanding they had learned too late. The Mediterranean sky, once a canvas of pride and control for Italian pilots, had transformed into a theater of fear. Every sortie carried an invisible weight, the knowledge that the Corsair was no ordinary opponent. Its lethal combination of speed, firepower, and resilience was now seared into the consciousness of every squadron. Fear spread not quietly but like wildfire, infecting formations long accustomed to confidence and bravado. Diaries and letters from pilots surviving these encounters paint a chilling portrait. One young aviator wrote, "I could feel my hands trembling on the controls before we even saw them. The Corsair wasn't just a plane, it was a shadow over the sky, and I wondered if I would see land again." Another recalled, "We knew their guns could kill, but we did not know they could erase an entire plane in seconds. Each tracer round was a heartbeat closer to the end." These testimonies reveal more than loss. They reveal the erosion of belief in their own skill and the crushing weight of anticipation. Radio transmissions from the front lines tell a similar story. Experienced pilots, trained to calculate and act under pressure, found themselves hesitating, second-guessing maneuvers, and retreating from engagements that they might have previously embraced. The sound of engines and gunfire became suffused with terror. Every distant hum could be a Corsair on approach, every shadow a harbinger of destruction. The sky itself felt hostile, turning every maneuver into a gamble against an unseen and superior intelligence. This psychological impact was compounded by the very nature of aerial combat. Unlike ground battles, where cover and terrain could shield soldiers, pilots were exposed, suspended in vast openness, with death arriving not with subtlety, but with precision and speed. Losing confidence mid-battle became as deadly as any enemy gun, Hesitation, over-correction, or misjudgment often led to catastrophic consequences, turning experienced aviators into victims not only of firepower but of fear itself. The spread of panic was subtle but relentless. Pilots spoke of a cold sweat that would grip them at the sight of the gull-winged silhouette, a nausea that came not from physical strain but from the knowledge of what could happen in an instant. Even those who survived their first engagements returned to base shaken, their debriefs punctuated by unease and a quiet, creeping dread. Commanders noticed a shift in morale. Formations were looser, aggression tempered, and calculated risk replaced by defensive caution, sometimes too late to save a comrade. Letters from home, written by the families of pilots, reveal an ironic cruelty. Mothers, fathers, and wives clung to hope, unaware of the terror their loved ones faced. Pilots themselves internalized this tension, forced to maintain composure while grappling with the ever-present knowledge that a single burst from a Corsair could erase hours of training and years of experience. By the end of this phase of the campaign, it was clear that the Corsair's greatest weapon was not only its 650 caliber guns, but the psychological dominance it exerted over the Italian squadrons. Fear became a silent partner in every engagement, turning even the most skilled aviators into shadows of their former confidence. The air battles above Sicily were no longer contests of ability alone. They were trials of courage, resilience, and the capacity to survive against a machine that demanded respect in equal measure to its firepower. For months, Axis propaganda had painted the American aircraft as clumsy, overgrown machines, harmless giants whose bulk and design were meant more for spectacle than for war. Leaflets, newspapers, and even radio broadcasts echoed the same message. The Allies' aircraft were impressive in size, yes, but slow, unwieldy, and easily outmaneuvered by the superior skill of Italian pilots. Confidence, already deeply rooted, was reinforced by these narratives. The men in the sky believed they were flying into contests they were destined to win. Reality, however, proved to be a far crueler teacher. As the Corsairs engaged, Italian pilots witnessed the devastating mismatch between propaganda and fact. Planes that had once seemed laughable in shape now moved with lethal precision, each gull-winged silhouette capable of delivering torrents of 50 caliber fire. Entire formations were shredded in minutes, leaving survivors in stunned disbelief. The carefully cultivated narrative of American ineptitude crumbled mid-air, replaced by an unflinching truth. These were machines built for destruction, piloted by men who knew their weapons intimately. The sense of betrayal was profound. Letters from pilots reveal a mixture of anger and despair. One wrote, "We were told these Americans were slow, almost foolish. We were told we would dominate. Now I can barely hold my plane together, let alone my nerve. They lied to us, or we were fools to believe them." The propaganda that had once buoyed morale now amplified the horror. Every Corsair engagement reminded them of the false security they had relied upon. Confidence, carefully nurtured by reports and reassurances from command, evaporated in the face of unrelenting reality. This contrast between expectation and outcome deepened the psychological toll. Pilots struggled to reconcile the images they had been fed with the ones they now saw. Flaming waves, wrecks spiraling toward the Mediterranean, colleagues disappearing in bursts of smoke and fire, and the relentless hum of engines that refused to yield. Misinformation, whether intentional or through ignorance, had left them vulnerable. Their tactics, training, and instincts, designed to exploit weaknesses that did not exist, were insufficient against a plane that had been underestimated in every conceivable way. The sense of betrayal extended beyond individual pilots to entire squadrons. Cohesion suffered as officers and men questioned both intelligence reports and strategic planning. Discussions and debriefings often turned into bitter admissions that they had been misled, misinformed, or simply blinded by overconfidence. The Corsair was no longer merely an enemy aircraft. It had become a symbol of everything they had misunderstood about the war in the air. Propaganda, once a tool for morale, became a weapon of irony. Its reassurances now clashed violently with reality, forcing pilots to confront the uncomfortable truth that the skies were no longer theirs to command. Every sortie that followed carried not only the physical danger of enemy fire, but also the invisible weight of mistrust, doubt, and the lingering echo of their own hubris. By the end of these early encounters, it was clear that myth and reality had collided with devastating effect. The Corsair was no slower, no clumsier, and certainly no weaker than the Axis pilots had been led to believe. In truth, it was faster, deadlier, and far more precise, a revelation that demanded not only respect but a complete reassessment of strategy, tactics, and expectation. Italian pilots prided themselves on their rigorous training, honed over years of practice and small-scale conflicts. Exercises focused on dogfighting with aircraft of similar size, speed, and maneuverability. The Macchi C-202 and C-205 provided ample challenge against familiar tactics. Pilots learned to exploit turns, climbs, and dives, mastering formations and coordinated attacks. Each maneuver was rehearsed, each reaction instinctive, until confidence became almost second nature. Yet the Corsair did not fit any of these patterns. Its design, from the inverted gull wings to its powerful radial engine, challenged every assumption Italian pilots carried into the sky. Turns that would trap a Spitfire or a Macchi were ineffective. Dives intended to gain energy advantage were anticipated and countered. The Corsair's acceleration and climb rate allowed it to dictate the flow of combat, striking from unexpected angles and disappearing before retaliatory fire could connect. Pilots who had trained to think in seconds of engagement now faced a machine that expanded the very definition of time and space in combat. The gap between training and reality became stark. One veteran pilot later noted in his diary, "Everything I had practiced, every tactic I had perfected, was useless against them. We were not ready for this. We were flying blind in a storm we did not understand." The Corsair's unconventional tactics, rapid boom and zoom attacks, steep climbs, and precise bursts from long range, exposed weaknesses in Italian doctrine that had been ignored or underestimated. What was once second nature now required improvisation under fire, a near impossible task when every second carried the risk of death. Skill, the cornerstone of a pilot's confidence, proved insufficient against technological inferiority. Years of training could not overcome an aircraft that outclassed them in every measurable way. Even the most experienced pilots felt the sting of helplessness, realizing that mastery of their own planes could not compensate for the Corsair's combination of speed, firepower, and maneuverability. The psychological blow was nearly as devastating as the physical one. Seasoned aviators who had survived countless sorties now questioned not their courage or ability, but the very fairness of the sky. Commanders attempted to adapt, revising training drills to prepare for encounters with the Corsair, but the learning curve was steep. Pilots had to unlearn assumptions ingrained over years and adopt new strategies mid-war, often under fire. Dogfighting techniques, previously reliable, became potential death traps if applied without modification. Every engagement forced a painful lesson. Technology could redefine combat, and the air war was no longer solely a test of skill, but a contest of engineering as much as strategy. By the end of these encounters, the message was clear. Italian training, while thorough and disciplined, could not fully equip pilots to face the Corsair. Survival required more than tactics. It required understanding, respect for the machine, and an acceptance that their previously unquestioned expertise was now only part of the equation. Skill alone could no longer guarantee success. Against the Corsair, it was insufficient without adaptation. The battles over Sicily and Sardinia were not isolated skirmishes. They were fragments of a much larger struggle for control of the Mediterranean. For years, the Axis had relied on air superiority to protect shipping lanes, support ground forces, and maintain dominance over the sea. Italian naval and air commanders believed that the skies, once patrolled by skilled aviators in familiar aircraft, could be controlled with calculated precision. But the arrival of the Corsair challenged every assumption, introducing a variable the Axis had neither anticipated nor prepared for. Allied forces, aware of the strategic importance of the Mediterranean, had begun to integrate the F4U Corsair into carrier-based operations with devastating effect. Aircraft carriers such as the USS Ranger and USS Enterprise provided mobility and protection for squadrons that could strike with surgical precision. From these platforms, Corsairs launched coordinated attacks not only against Italian aircraft but also against supply convoys, harbors, and naval installations, leveraging their speed and firepower to shift the balance of power in the theater. The Italians, whose air doctrine had focused on engagements with similarly equipped planes, now faced a threat capable of undermining both sea and air control simultaneously. The immediate impact of these engagements was profound. Air superiority, once assumed by the Axis over key Mediterranean zones, began to tilt toward the Allies. Italian and German pilots found themselves reacting defensively rather than executing offensive sweeps. Convoys that had previously traversed the sea with minimal harassment now required heavy escort and constant vigilance. Naval commanders reported increased losses, and the psychological advantage, once firmly in Axis hands, shifted rapidly as pilots recounted Corsair attacks that left them scattered and outgunned. Axis, forces scrambled to respond, improvising tactics and revising operational priorities. Squadrons were redirected, formations tightened, and new defensive protocols hastily drawn. But the combination of inadequate intelligence and the sheer superiority of the Corsair made adaptation difficult. Pilots were being forced to fight not just an enemy in the air, but a war that had evolved beyond the parameters they had trained for. Even seasoned commanders admitted that their confidence in controlling the Mediterranean skies was now fragile, tested by aircraft that could dictate engagement on its own terms. Reports from the front described chaotic air battles, with Italian planes attempting to protect naval convoys, while simultaneously confronting a foe whose superior speed and firepower allowed it to attack at will. The Mediterranean, long considered a domain of Axis strength, became a proving ground for Allied aerial dominance. Each encounter with Corsairs weakened morale, stretched resources, and highlighted the strategic consequences of misjudging technological advancement. In this context, the Corsair was not just a plane, it was a tool of strategic leverage, reshaping the balance of power across the region. Its presence forced the Axis to confront a new reality. Victories were no longer guaranteed by tradition or training. The battle for the Mediterranean was now a contest of adaptation, innovation, and survival. For Italian pilots, every sortie was no longer just about skill. It was about facing a rapidly changing war in which the rules had shifted beneath their wings. The roar of engines filled the sky as Italian pilots found themselves locked in a deadly dance with the gull-winged Corsairs. From the cockpit, every second stretched into an eternity. Smoke trailed past wings, and bursts of tracer fire stitched the air with deadly precision. One pilot later recalled, "I banked hard, thinking I had some advantage, and then I saw it. My wingman's fuselage ripped open. Pieces of his plane fell like rain, and I realized this wasn't just a fight. It was slaughter." Radio chatter crackled with panic. "We can't keep up," shouted one young aviator, his voice trembling. Another replied, "Hold formation, don't break." But even the most disciplined commands were drowned out by the chaos. The Corsairs struck with a coordination that felt almost instinctive, moving in pairs and striking with lethal bursts from 650 caliber guns. Pilots who had once felt invincible were suddenly acutely aware of their vulnerability, every maneuver scrutinized by the deadly logic of an enemy they had underestimated. One pilot described the sensation as surreal. It was as if the sky itself had turned against us. Every time I tried to climb, a Corsair was there, guns spitting fire. Every dive meant I risked losing my tail, or worse, my life. The combination of speed, armament, and aggression left little room for recovery. Some pilots attempted evasive rolls or sudden dives, hoping to shake off the attackers, only to find themselves targeted in a pattern they could not anticipate. The human element, the fear, astonishment, and rapid decision-making, was palpable. In diaries recovered after the war, one aviator wrote, "I kept thinking, this can't be happening. They are supposed to be slow. And then my plane shuddered as bullets tore through my left wing. I prayed I could survive until I reached the water." Another recounted desperately trying to protect a comrade. "I banked toward him, but he was already hit. I could see the flames climbing the fuselage, and there was nothing I could do but watch." Even seasoned veterans were shaken to their core. Men who had faced British Hurricanes and Spitfires, who had executed precision attacks over North Africa, now found themselves caught off guard by the sheer audacity and power of the Corsair. Every engagement was a test of nerves, reflexes, and endurance, with no guarantee of survival. The battle was not only physical but psychological, a confrontation in which hesitation or misjudgment could instantly become fatal. Through these personal accounts, the true horror of the dogfight emerges. The sky, once a symbol of freedom and mastery, became a crucible of fear and astonishment. The pilots' experiences, their voices, and their struggles make it clear that this was more than an aerial encounter. It was a trial by fire, an encounter that tested courage, skill, and the limits of human endurance. Audiences can almost hear the engines, feel the tracers whistling past, and understand the raw terror of men facing a machine that laughed last and killed first. The sky had quieted, but its silence was deceptive. Smoke still drifted lazily above the Mediterranean, curling from twisted metal and shattered wings that had once carried proud Italian pilots. Wreckage floated in the sparkling waters below, a grim testament to the sudden and overwhelming power of the Corsair. Retreating pilots returned to base, battered, shaken, and haunted by the images they had witnessed. The echoes of roaring engines and tracer fire lingered in memory, a reminder that the battle was not just lost, it had been dominated. Operational reports began to reveal the stark reality. Squadrons had lost multiple aircraft in a single sortie, and many pilots required immediate medical attention, some for physical wounds, others for psychological trauma. Casualty numbers, though initially minimized in official communiques, told a story of sudden attrition and strategic vulnerability. Aerial dominance, once presumed secure over the southern Mediterranean, had been challenged with devastating efficiency. Commanders quickly realized that every Corsair sortie had the potential not only to down planes, but to erode the very morale of their air forces. The aftermath was not just measured in destroyed aircraft, but in the ripple effects on Italian operational capabilities. Retreats were hasty, coordination faltered, and naval convoys faced new threats as Allied air superiority tightened. Training and tactics previously sufficient to dominate the skies were now outdated. Every engagement required reconsideration, every mission demanded more caution, and every pilot returned with the heavy burden of witnessing friends and comrades struck down in moments of unrelenting violence. For the men on the ground and in the air, the Corsair had become more than a plane. It was a symbol of technological supremacy and the harsh consequences of misjudgment. Its presence reshaped Italian perception of aerial warfare, forcing planners and pilots alike to acknowledge the widening gap between skill and firepower. Even seasoned veterans were forced to reflect on their assumptions. The skies no longer offered guarantees, and hubris had become a dangerous liability. Letters and diaries written in the days following the encounters conveyed a mixture of despair, frustration, and grudging respect. One pilot noted, "We thought we knew the skies, but they were lying in wait for us. That plane, it was faster, stronger, and smarter than anything we imagined. We cannot fight it as we fought others." The Corsair had not merely won battles, it had rewritten the rules of engagement, forcing a recalibration of strategy, tactics, and expectations over the Mediterranean. This realization marked a turning point. The Corsair was not just an opponent to be defeated, it was a disruptive force, reshaping the theater of war itself. Italian pilots and commanders alike had to confront a sobering truth. Survival and success in the skies would no longer depend solely on experience or bravery, but on adaptability, respect for technological advantage, and the ability to respond to a foe that had redefined air combat in a single, explosive encounter. The Mediterranean, once considered a stage for Italian mastery, had become a proving ground for Allied air power, and in the wreckage, in the smoke, and in the fear etched into every returning pilot, the Corsair's shadow loomed large, reminding all who survived that the war above the waves had irrevocably changed. The Corsair was not just a plane, it was a weapon of deliberate design, optimized for domination in the air. Its American pilots had been trained to exploit every advantage this machine offered, executing tactics that seemed almost instinctual but were in fact calculated to lethal precision. Among the most effective was the boom and zoom attack, a high-speed dive from altitude, striking a target with maximum energy, then climbing back to a position of safety before the enemy could respond. The combination of speed, firepower, and climb rate allowed them to engage on their terms and disengage almost at will. Wing loading, a measure of how much weight each unit of wing area must support, gave the Corsair remarkable stability in dives and rapid accelerations. Where Italian fighters relied on tight turns and dogfighting, the Corsair exploited energy tactics, trading altitude for speed and striking with bursts of .50 caliber fire before its adversaries could react. Pilots described a terrifying efficiency. A single dive could destroy one aircraft and place the Corsair in a position to strike again moments later. It was not brute force alone, it was a disciplined, systematic application of physics, engineering, and training designed to overwhelm opponents who expected conventional engagements. American pilots, well aware of their machine's advantages, coordinated attacks with discipline. They avoided prolonged turning fights that favored lighter Italian planes, instead using vertical maneuvers to control distance, dictate the flow of engagement, and target aircraft with surgical precision. Formation flying amplified this effect. Pairs or trios of Corsairs would sweep through enemy squadrons like predators circling their prey, exploiting the chaos of panic and miscalculated maneuvers. Their success was a combination of mechanical superiority and tactical intelligence, a combination that Axis pilots could neither predict nor easily counter. Italian pilots, by contrast, were forced to improvise. Formation integrity often broke under the relentless pressure, and maneuvers designed for older adversaries were neutralized by the Corsair's superior climb, acceleration, and firepower. The Axis scrambled to adapt, experimenting with defensive patterns, tighter formations, and evasive tactics, but each engagement revealed the depth of the Corsair's advantage. Every sortie underscored a bitter truth. Raw skill alone could not compensate for the calculated exploitation of technological superiority. Even as they retreated, the surviving Italian pilots observed the methodical efficiency of the Corsairs. They noted the precision, the coordination, and the terrifying effectiveness of these boom-and-zoom strikes. Many wrote later that it was as if the aircraft itself dictated the rules of combat, forcing them into defensive maneuvers with no hope of turning the tide. Confidence eroded with every encounter, replaced by cautious respect and, in some cases, outright fear. The lessons of these encounters were clear and unavoidable. The Corsair had transformed aerial combat over the Mediterranean into a contest of controlled aggression, energy management, and technological exploitation. Axis pilots had to rethink not only their tactics, but the very assumptions upon which their confidence had been built. In every dive, every turn, and every burst of .50 caliber fire, the Americans demonstrated a level of air strategy that reshaped the balance of power and left the Italians scrambling to survive. The devastation wrought by the Corsair forced Italian forces to confront a hard truth. Traditional tactics and assumptions could no longer secure dominance in the Mediterranean skies. Every sortie, every loss, and every frantic radio call underscored a simple fact. The Allies had introduced a plane that redefined aerial combat. Survival demanded adaptation, and adaptation demanded not only courage, but a willingness to abandon long-held doctrines. Squadrons began to revise their approach. Leaders implemented tighter formations to reduce vulnerability, ensuring that pilots could provide mutual support in the face of the Corsair's relentless speed and firepower. New engagement protocols emphasized altitude management, encouraging pilots to conserve energy rather than engage in prolonged turning battles. Dive and zoom counters were studied and adapted from American tactics, though the gap in aircraft performance meant that imitating the Corsair's maneuvers was often only partially successful. Training programs also shifted. Pilots were drilled to anticipate sudden strikes, maintain discipline under fire, and recognize the signs of an approaching boom and zoom attack. Emphasis was placed on reconnaissance and situational awareness, attempting to predict when and where Corsairs might strike rather than reacting only after engagement. Commanders realized that preparation and anticipation could mitigate, but not eliminate, the terrifying advantages of the American fighter. Adaptation was slow and painful. Early attempts often failed, resulting in more losses, fractured morale, and mounting frustration. Experienced pilots noted that instincts forged through years of conventional dogfighting now required retraining. "We had to unlearn everything we thought we knew," one aviator wrote. "Every maneuver I relied on before was a liability. Survival now depended on understanding them, not just outmaneuvering them." The psychological weight of this learning curve was immense, as pilots grappled with the realization that mistakes no longer meant defeat. They meant death. Despite setbacks, incremental progress emerged. Some squadrons learned to use cloud cover, terrain, and timing to reduce exposure, while others coordinated with anti-aircraft batteries to supplement aerial defense. While none could match the Corsair in raw performance, these adaptations demonstrated resilience, ingenuity, and a grudging respect for their enemy. Slowly, the narrative of helplessness shifted toward one of cautious strategy, with survival becoming the highest form of victory. In broader terms, these adaptations reflected the larger war effort. The Italian Air Force recognized that technological inferiority could not always be offset by skill alone, but clever application of strategy, discipline, and resourcefulness could still influence outcomes. While the Corsair had rewritten the rules of aerial combat, it also forced the Axis to innovate, rethink, and adapt, albeit under extreme pressure and at great cost. By the end of this phase, the lesson was unmistakable. Adaptation was inevitable. The Italians could no longer rely on outdated doctrine or propaganda. They had to confront the full reality of their opponent, retool their tactics, and endure the harsh learning curve of facing a machine designed to dominate the sky. It was a painful, costly process. But in the crucible of the Mediterranean air war, adaptation was the only path to survival. The Mediterranean skies of 1943 bore witness to a harsh lesson. Overconfidence, no matter how deeply ingrained, could be shattered in moments when faced with innovation. The Corsair, with its formidable combination of speed, firepower, and agility, redefined the rules of aerial combat for Italian pilots and forced a recalibration of strategy, tactics, and expectation. What had begun as laughter at the gull-winged silhouette ended in shock, fear, and a reluctant admiration for an aircraft that could so decisively dominate the skies. The impact on Axis air superiority was profound. Squadrons that once patrolled with confidence now approached missions with caution, aware that every sortie carried unprecedented risk. Morale, once buoyed by belief in their own aircraft and skill, had been tempered by the reality of facing a plane that could outmatch them at every turn. Letters, diaries, and post-war interviews consistently reflect the psychological weight carried by pilots who survived these encounters. Each recalled the surreal combination of awe and terror that defined their confrontations with the Corsair, men forced to reconcile their training with a reality they had never imagined. The Corsair's legacy extends beyond the immediate tactical outcomes. It symbolizes how innovation can disrupt assumptions and upend established hierarchies, a lesson painfully internalized by Italian forces. Overconfidence, reinforced by propaganda and past victories, proved deadly when confronted by a technological leap. The laughter that greeted the Corsair's arrival was silenced by the precise language of its 650 caliber guns, a lesson encoded not only in wreckage and loss, but in the psyche of every pilot who had underestimated it. Reflecting on these events, it becomes clear that the Corsair did more than win battles. It reshaped the narrative of Mediterranean air warfare. It forced the E-axis to adapt, to rethink dogfighting strategies, and to confront the stark reality that survival depended on respect for technological advantage as much as skill or courage. Its presence left an indelible mark on the war, demonstrating that in combat, as in life, arrogance can be swiftly and violently corrected by innovation and preparation. They laughed at the Corsair, one surviving Italian pilot later wrote, until the 50s spoke. Those 6 barrels, firing with relentless precision, spoke louder than any propaganda or assumption. They told a story of dominance, adaptation, and the harsh consequences of underestimating one's enemy, a story etched into the sky, into the wreckage, and into history itself. For viewers fascinated by the hidden stories of Vought F4U, the Corsair's Mediterranean campaign serves as a vivid reminder. War is never just about numbers or bravery. It is about understanding your opponent, respecting innovation, and surviving the moments when assumptions are proven fatally wrong. If you found this story compelling, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because next we uncover how a single Allied fighter squadron changed the course of the Mediterranean War.